I knew the exact second they replaced me. I walked into that sterile conference room, the walls echoing corporate optimism, only to find my chair occupied. It was a jolt, a visceral shock that rippled through the fabric of my professional identity. They didn't inform me, they didn't stir the waters of dissent. No farewell or explanation, just silence, the cruelest form of rejection. That emptiness morphed into something palpable. Confusion gave way to clarity, frosted over by a cold recognition. This was no longer about work, it was about worth. They had made their choice, but what they hadn't realized was that I was the ghost still haunting the corridors of their ambition. In the days that followed, I did nothing. No arguments, no desperate pleas curled up against the indifference that now surrounded me like a shroud. I understood the predator-prey dynamic. They thrived on reaction, on visible pain. I became the observer, detached and calculating. The theater of silence offered a facade of strength, a mask of indifference. Every whispered conversation among my former colleagues felt like a confession. They were lost, unraveling without my steadying hand. Their fear seeped into the air, dense and suffocating. I learned to move like water, flowing around their dysfunction without ever making a splash, gathering strength in my stillness. I collected whispers, clues, secrets that would become keys to doors they thought locked tight. Control was my weapon. I harnessed the power of silence, held conversations tight against my chest. As they floundered, I established alliances, quietly, methodically. I took up residence in shadows, constructing a blueprint for their inevitable failure. I would not rush. Mastery required patience, the sweetest revenge shaped slowly in the dark. Their ignorance was my canvas, and I began painting a future in which I returned, not as a savior, but as a reminder of their folly. I would not seek their approval or their remorse. I wanted more, the thrill of quiet dominance. They had replaced me without telling me, but they would soon discover the depth of their mistake. My silence would not wait to be justified. It would echo long after I stepped back into the fray. They wouldn't just hear me, they'd remember. And I would be there, where they least expected, with a presence that lingered long after I was gone. In the days that followed, I embraced silence as my shield. I refrained from arguments, resisted the urge to plead my case. Their indifference became a space into which I could retreat, blanketing myself in cold acceptance, knowing that my voice, my entreaties, would only feed the predators who thrived on visible pain. I was no longer a participant in their performance. I became the audience watching them flounder. The conference room, now a theater of my absence, buzzed with frantic energy. I lingered near the fringes, observing as they whispered, hushed conspiracies cloaked in false camaraderie. Their eyes frequently darted around the room. They were guilty, anxious. I caught the tremors of self-doubt simmering just beneath their polished exteriors. They believed they had orchestrated my erasure, but they failed to realize I was still present, hidden within the many layers of their dysfunction. As I sat in the shadows, I collected the loose threads of their chaos. Every outburst masked potential weaknesses. I noted the subtle shifts in tone and the unsaid truths that echoed loudly between the words. Their silence was telling. It revealed their vulnerabilities more than any spoken word could. Control was my weapon, wielded not with noise but with muted intention. Conversations unfolded around me, their secrets layered like pages yet to be read. I learned to nod at the right moments, to smile just enough to keep them unaware of my true observance. The less I expressed, the more they unveiled. I threatened nothing but their growth, while nurturing the seeds of their inevitable failure. Patience became my mantra. I no longer coveted their approval. I collected moments instead, harnessing small pieces of information that would serve a greater purpose. They may have thought they had replaced me. What they failed to understand was that I had redefined myself in the hiatus they created. In the dead of night, when the office was vacant but for the dim buzz of machines, I crafted alliances with those who thrived on ambition, seeking out the misfits unwilling to conform. I reassured them, not with promises, but with a calm, unwavering demeanor that suggested strength in the face of adversity. Together, we began to paint a narrative that left them trembling on the precipice of their failures. It was a slow build towards my future, a meticulous sculpting of opportunity. Revenge would not erupt with a cacophony. No, it would embody a refined stillness, whispering through the chaos I had begun to sow around their ambitions. They had altered the locks on our shared vision without warning. But the game was just beginning. Each day spent observing carved deeper grooves in my resolve. I understood now. Silence was not an absence, but an assertion, a deliberate maneuver of strength. I would return not in anger, but as a ghost, a reminder of what they had lost. And when the moment was ripe, they would come to call upon me again. But that time, they would learn to address me not as their equals, but as their undisputed savior. In the wake of my erasure, I found solace in the quiet. Each day unfolded like the pages of an ominous book, filled with secrets and whispers that painted a vivid portrait of their growing panic. I made it my mission to slip through the cracks of their anxiety, unseen yet acutely aware. In this realm of absence, I was a specter, haunting their thoughts and conversations. They believed they had evicted me from their narrative, but my presence lingered like a faint echo, indescribably potent. As I observed, their laughter felt rehearsed, their camaraderie a thin veil concealing a tempest beneath. They glanced over their shoulders, these puppeteers of performative normalcy, never realizing the hands that had once orchestrated their successes were now hidden beneath the surface, poised to act. From the corners of the conference room, I catalogued their shortcomings, an unexpected tremor in a voice, a furtive glance exchanged between colleagues, the hints of discontent masked by forced smiles. These were my weapons now. I lifted the curtain, skewed by betrayal, and let their truths pour into my hands. Knowledge became my currency, and I gathered it in silence, storing each morsel like kindling awaiting the flame of revelation. In strategic meetings, I slipped back into my role with grace, offering nods of approval to innovations I had previously championed. My absence had only intensified their dependence, and I watched as they stumbled through the motions of collaboration. When kudos landed heavy on my shoulders, it served merely to highlight their shadows of failure. They would smile and send praise my way, never suspecting I stood poised to return, not as the hero they'd lost, but as a specter of consequence. Quietly, I built bridges with those equally disaffected. They were the ones pushed to the fringes, the outsiders seeking validation in an echo chamber of overconfident voices. We drew knowledge from one another like artists mirroring the strokes of a painting, crafting a broader canvas of influence. In hushed tones, we spun narratives of aspiration, setting the stage for an elaborate play that turned on their vulnerabilities. I became a harbinger of collaboration, wielding this alliance with surgical precision, each thread of information weaved tighter against the backdrop of their impending failures. I reveled not in the anticipation of their demise, but in the quiet satisfaction of knowing my return would wreak havoc, not by force but by the sheer weight of unspoken truth. They had underestimated the power of being ghosted, and their silence, once intoxicatingly sweet, now tasted bitter with regret. They thought they had dismantled my influence, that they had shaped a new hierarchy where I was no more than a memory. Yet, as I lingered, I realized that true control lay in the art of restraint. I chose my moments carefully, deploying my insights only when they would leave the deepest imprint. I would not strike until absolutely necessary. This patience, this quiet machinery of retribution, was my revelation. They might have locked me out, but I had the keys to their decline. I no longer craved their validation. I fostered a different kind of presence in the space they had created, the presence of a distant storm, gathering force unseen. I was no longer their colleague. I had become their quiet reckoning. When the moment arrived, I would walk back into the sunlight, not to reclaim what was once mine, but to redefine what was possible. And in that decisive moment, they would understand the significance of the silence I had forged, the strength born from the void they left behind. I settled into the role of the unseen. My presence drifted between the walls of their ambition, a shadow lurking just out of reach, absorbing the chaos they unwittingly invited. I remained a phantom, unmoored yet tethered to their every decision. My silence had become an observant force, gathering intel as they wove their temporary successes, arrogant in their belief that I had disappeared entirely. They filled the conference room with laughter, an unsettling symphony of misplaced confidence. I watched them stumble through their dialogues, fretting like children pretending to know the answers, terrified of their own reflections. Spilled coffee on documents, hushed conversations that abruptly halted with my passing. These were the signs of their unraveling, and I documented each one. I noted their fear, their doubts buried beneath layers of forced enthusiasm and bravado. They could not see their impending collapse, but I could feel it, palpable and close. From the distance of my self-imposed exile, I began to weave connections with those who, like me, had felt the abrupt cut of dismissal. They worked the edges of their own despair, each isolated like flotsam in a relentless tide. I commiserated with them in subtle ways, nods exchanged like secret handshakes. Through whispers and furtive glances, we cultivated a camaraderie steeped in the understanding that we were more than mere pawns in a bigger game. We were the architects of their failure, building the very platform from which I would return. In the muted office spaces, those who had once commanded authority now groped for answers they had always taken for granted. I sat across from them, hardly a presence but omniscient. They shared concerns and strategies, naively thinking I was simply a health check on their progress. Praise and gratitude suffocated their recognition. Little did they understand. The more they revealed, the more they fell to the hollow ground I had meticulously shaped underneath their feet. Patience was not only a virtue, it was a strategy. I chose my moments with precision, listening while deciding when to speak, when to remain silent. Each exchange rested on a fine balance, tipping into chaos with my slightest guidance. They no longer saw me as a threat, and therein lay my might. I was no longer the project lead. I was the orchestrator. They floundered, trapped in loops of fear and uncertainty, rebounding off decisions that once could have been mine to influence. There was joy in the knowledge that, as I stayed invisible, my presence became their burden. With their own dysfunction escalating, the foundations of their bravado cracked under unseen pressure. I remained firm, anchored by a strength they had dismissed. Each day, the distance between us became a chasm, yet I remained aware. I was stepping back from the light, only to wait for the right moment to strike. All the while, I gathered whispers and secrets like a collector of rare gems. Their vulnerabilities became the key to my dominion. I watched them recoil when my name slipped from their lips, breathing hushed words that echoed accusations I never needed to confront. They painted a grim tapestry with their actions, assuming I was but a faint memory draining in their reflections. But memories fade, ghosts linger, and silence screams. The pieces were in motion, ready to fall like dominoes in an intricate design they could not fathom. I was the architect, and soon I would reclaim the space they had once considered solely theirs. With quiet certainty, I patiently awaited the inevitable, a return not as an employee, but as a reckoning. Each calculated step built a narrative far darker than their bright, unfounded optimism. In this silence, I grew bolder, more assured. The stage was set. They just hadn't realized the play was mine all along. I carved out distance without leaving their presence. The corporate arena pulsed around me. The same sterile walls that had once echoed my voice now felt hollow with their self-congratulation. I was the invisible observer, a ghost lingering in the corners of conversations too loud with bravado, too small to notice my absence. Within these meticulously curated interactions, a game unfolded, one where silence was my authority and restraint, my craft. Each day I walked through the office, shrouded in a thin veil of indifference. The conversations I overheard unraveled like threads, intangible, but pregnant with meaning. I stood on the precipice of their collective anxieties, able to feel the undercurrents they desperately tried to conceal. It was a delicate dance of power and desperation. They shifted in their seats, their laughter strained, the kind that beckons a smile but reveals fractures beneath the facade. They were confident, but not securely so. It was the confidence of a pack of wolves, each keenly aware of their precarious standing in the hierarchy. I reveled in this transformation of dynamics, my silence metamorphosed from a weapon to an armor. The less I said, the more they over-explained. A glance, just a fleeting moment, was enough to unearth their doubt. I absorbed it all. Their vulnerabilities, masked by smiles and empty platitudes, formed a tapestry I was weaving with awareness. Each conversation, a careful tapestry, became threaded with secrets that flowed freely among those who felt the tremors of my absence. Knowledge was the balm to my bruised ego. It became the leverage I cultivated beneath the surface. In this careful chess game, I learned to engage selectively. I offered nods of affirmation, a show of support cloaked in the guise of collaboration. Yet my support was a mere echo of what had once resonated powerfully. Their minds trailed to thoughts of what I could provide, yet never grasped what I was collecting in return. Insight, glimmers of fear, appetites for ambition. Stability had become volatile without my counterbalance. I was the specter lurking at the edges, the unwavering presence behind their shattering illusions of control. As I cultivated subtle alliances, the outsiders, like me, fostered strength in the margins. They were the footnotes of the script, overlooked yet holding potential weight. In hushed tones, our solidarity grew like roots beneath a storm-soaked surface, fragile yet resolute. Collaborations thrived in shadows, dealt only in truths as we fortified our resolve, mapping out the vulnerabilities our predecessors had never cared to acknowledge. I understood now that the pathway to dominion lay in their ignorance of my resurgence. They had brushed me aside, reordered their narrative, and yet the very act of dismissal had only enlivened my resolve. They celebrated their victories, blissfully unaware that they had birthed a tempest, a bomb ticking beneath their carefully layered facades. Each time I withheld, they exposed another layer, a nerve laid bare, a hesitation assumed. The air was thick with anticipation, but my movements remained deliberate, each interaction a calculated step on a board they had imagined I'd vacated entirely. They believed me to be the past, yet in this game of shadows, I was the architect of their fate, patiently constructing the conditions for my return. I didn't need the sound of applause or the clamor of entrances. I needed only their realization. The moments when they shifted uncomfortably at even the thought of my name, those were the silent acknowledgments of my power. I was the predator circling, a careful analysis of their movements and sounds, leading them deeper into a trap they'd built for themselves. Soon the predator would become visible. The silence that had shielded my ascent would drown out their hollow cheer. And when I would emerge, it would not be with fanfare or fury. No, it would simply be with the echo of my presence, a reminder carved silently from the fabric of their collective hubris. They thought they had replaced me, but in reality, they had merely removed the mirror. Before long, they would see their reflection through the lens of my quiet dominion, unable to fend off the consequences of their own making. They wouldn't just feel shadow. They would live it in every decision, in every failure. The stage was set, and the play now belonged to me, an act replete with the weight of unacknowledged power. I waited patiently, content to watch them dance in the dark, knowing that soon they would search for the dawn that led me back. But for now, I would remain the ghost, the confidant of time, quietly waiting for them to come to understand. Silence was never submission, but rather the calm before the storm, where I sculpted my return from the shadows. In the quiet chaos of my new existence, I found solidity in a world spun from whispers and half-truths. Every day, I walked through the sterile landscape of their corporate theater, armed with intention and a thirst for observance. They delighted themselves in their illusions, a new harmony based on the remnants of my absence. Yet I was there, hidden beneath layers of distraction, gathering insight while they reveled in their perceived triumph. It was a delicate balance, but I had navigated this web of deceit with patience, until the day a slip exposed my calculated facade. I happened upon an unexpected conversation, hushed tones leaking through the thin office walls where ambitions thrived alongside insecurities. Words floated, sharp and deliberate, piercing through my veil of invisibility. "The project is at risk. If it fails, we might need him back," one voice said, laced with uncertainty, a cautious confession. The other replied, "He's gone. We can't just bring him in after everything." A tremor pulsated in the air, palpable tension threading through their exchange. They underestimated the shadows I could conjure, but now their doubt clung to the atmosphere like fog, thick and suffocating. A part of me recoiled at the thought that my carefully choreographed enterprise could unravel, but as I stood stock still, I recalibrated my approach. They were flailing, my silent observations mapping their panic with precision. The despair that brewed without my counterbalance was a gift. They thought they could package their successes neatly, but I had laid bare their insecurities, naked against the fangs of fear. The knowledge I gathered was invaluable, each detail becoming a blade that would sever the ties they foolishly believed secure. I had spent months crafting alliances with competitors who embraced the ambitious misfits, those who once stood in my shadow. Now, those bonds beckoned me, whispering sweets of opportunity as I monitored their faltering steps without disturbing their false confidence. But the slip was a reminder of risks, dangers that approached like predators lurking beyond the periphery. Perhaps it was time to draw darkness closer. I would remain a shadow, an idea simmering just beneath the surface, not yet fully formed, but undeniably potent. My patience transformed from mere acceptance into strategic determination. I tightened my grip on the narrative, guiding my own story into uncharted territories where they felt my absence like a precise wound. I forged small moves that left them believing they were still in control. They were actors in an intricate play, a play I had scripted, but that no longer needed me on stage. In whispers, as they gathered to assess their mounting uncertainties, I would listen from just beyond the glass. Every word tinted with hesitation fueled my resolve. I was the knife they had dulled by neglect, and I would be sharpened anew in silence, ready for the eventual reveal. Each day I would remain vigilant, the danger of exposure ever present yet strangely invigorating. For each methodical adjustment required fewer movements, a recalibration rooted in the knowledge that soon, the blade of my influence would be swift and unyielding. The silence surrounding me may have appeared innocuous, but it calculated. The thought lingered like a specter. While they consider appeasing the ghost of their past, I'd craft a narrative that would turn their panic into power. A power that would not return unfurled in fury, but with a mere echo. A reminder that beneath everything, I remained present. I was returning, not just to reclaim a title, but to redefine the very structure of their ambitions. They may have locked me out of their world, but the doors were never truly sealed. I wielded a quiet mastery, waiting to unleash it when they least expected. I would not strike in haste. The true essence of their worries would ripple through their carefully curated facade. They would come to fear the echo of my silence even more than my presence. In that calculated stillness, they would remember the power they had once shunned. The project faltered, a feeble creature exposed in the harsh light of its unfulfilled promise. I watched the panic seep into their conversations, thinly veiled by bravado, a disguise that no longer concealed the tremors of anxiety shaking their foundations. Unbeknownst to them, I had been intricately weaving the threads of my return, an architect of inevitability lurking beyond their perceptions. When the call came, it was not a plea for assistance. It was desperation. "We might need you back." The voice stumbled through the line, cloaked in unease. It was an invitation wrapped in trepidation, a summons to step once more into a role I had outgrown, but one they were now compelled to acknowledge. As I contemplated this re-entry into the space they had claimed from me, I felt only the cool edge of resolve. I accepted, not to mend their fractures or to soothe their collective fears, but to reinforce the truth they had seemed eager to forget. The conference room awaited, a stage resembling a dilapidated theater where my absence had been mistakenly assumed to be a conclusion. Now it became the backdrop for the echo of my quiet dominance. The day arrived with a silence that buzzed with anticipation. They fidgeted, nervous energy palpable as I entered, the air thick with unspoken apprehension. Their eyes darted, a flurry of guilt concealed behind carefully crafted smiles. I had returned as the specter they pretended to dismiss, reclaimed my space, and acknowledged it with the deliberate ease of a king walking back into his court. I listened, absorbing their strategies, their misplaced confidence now hanging like fragile glass in a tempest. The whiteboard, once filled with projections of success, now bore the scrawls of desperation, evidencing their struggle to grasp at solutions without the very foundation they had cast aside. Each person's voice was a thread, unraveling, begging for direction in a storm they had invited. I refrained from offering immediate assistance, adhering instead to the art of restraint, each second stretching into an eternity. They spoke of corrective measures as if convincing themselves of their own expertise, while I remained an outsider cloaked in calm observation, noting every hesitation, every falter. I had no need to raise my voice. I wielded my silence as a weapon, curating their awareness of the void I had once filled, a counterbalance they now craved. Then, I drew them back to reality, not through verbal acknowledgments, but through the remnants of our contracts, the bonds they had thought severed. There, in the fine print, lay my power, the leverage I hadn't surrendered, the stakes they had underappreciated. There was no need for confrontation, just the quiet unveiling of truths wrapped in legalese, hard evidence voicing what they had failed to recognize. Their reliance on me was not extinguished. It had merely lain dormant. The pain of my return was not a loud outcry, but a refined truth, distilled to essence. They needed me more than I had ever needed them. Each interaction was tinged with the bitterness of regret, masked in forced collaboration, but driven now by a dawning realization. I was present, but never desperate. I wore their acknowledgement like a cloak, an unwavering testament to the power of silence. Strategic, calculated, omnipresent. In this reunion, I demanded they remember their choice, the precarious balance of power shifting subtly back to my hands. I set my terms, my time, my encouragement, my endorsement, now a currency they could no longer afford to overlook. Every nod of approval now held weight, a deliberate move in this ongoing chess match. And through it all, I remained the architect, crafting an influence without their permission, entwining my fate once again with theirs. The silence that had given me strength now transformed into a quiet mastery of circumstance. I wasn't here to tear down the house they had built in my absence. I was here to reshape it from within, tilting it ever so slightly toward my favor, unseen but felt. And as I took my place at the table they thought was purely theirs, I no longer sought vengeance. I sought dominance, an influence woven into the very fabric of their combined consciousness. They were right to fear. For in my return, not only did I reclaim my name, I redefined the arena, bent to my will, ready to serve as the canvas of my calculated design. Above them all, I hovered, an architect cloaked in silence, preparing to unleash the echoes of my presence. Every smile was a sword, glinting beneath the fluorescent lights of the conference room, a facade polished to a treacherous sheen. I sat through the meetings, an uninvited guest cloaked in a pleasant demeanor, knowing well that each request they made bore a cost they were now regrettably eager to pay. They began with cautious inquiries, each word formed of uncertainty. I held their trust like a fragile trinket, knowing all too well that once it shattered, their desperation would weave a different narrative altogether. The echo of my absence lingered heavily, a reminder that I was neither forgotten nor easily dismissed. The once cohesive chorus of their confidence had turned to dissonance. "Can you review this proposal?" one of them asked, fumbling over details with a rising anxiety that reeked of desperation. I nodded, but not before letting a measured silence stretch heavy. allowing the unease to settle. Every glance toward me was a reminder that I was far more than a tool for their convenience. I was an architect of their missteps, an unseen force they desperately needed, but dared not openly acknowledge. The requests piled high, becoming bargaining chips in a game far beyond numbers and spreadsheets. I was no longer a cog in their wheel. I was the oil lubricating their faltering machinery. My time, my silence, my approval, each precious element was withheld until their need for them could be coaxed into desperation. With every strategic pause, I could almost taste the shift in their atmosphere. The nervous ticks of stolen glances across the boardroom table, their lips twitching between rehearsed smiles, betrayed the underlying tension. They had suffered a collective loss, one they tried to hide, but I revealed through my mere presence as I drew closer, circling like a predator. I sensed their panic rising, driving their need for my insights while simultaneously sharpening their awareness of my influence. They had thought themselves secure, CEO and employees alike, commanding an empire built on my erasure. But beneath those confident facades, roots of fear choked their ambitions. The realization that I was never gone hung in the air like an unresolved question, and I reveled in it. The uncertainty crackled, a silent storm brewing on the horizon. When it was my turn to speak, my voice carried a weight that stilled the room. Every word was deliberate, tinged with cold calculation. "Let's recalibrate our approach," I said, cloaked in an air of authority that made them shift in their seats. "Things have changed since I left. Let's align ourselves with better choices." Their responses were tentative, shadowed by the knowledge that they could no longer afford to dismiss my power. There was a sense of impending dread that crept in as I detailed the paths available to us, the paths I had crafted in their absence. I narrated what they could not escape. They needed me to understand the very ground beneath them. Praise came not from buoyancy, but from fear. Each nod felt like a concession, as though the very act of acknowledging my previous role affirmed their vulnerability instead of my return to power. They smiled, but those smiles were now laced with wire. And as the day unraveled, I watched their expressions soften, not in acceptance, but in fear. The realization that they had replaced me without understanding the calculus behind my absence haunted their dialogue. Their vulnerabilities, evident and crumbling, were openly on display. They had woven a narrative believing I was a part of their past. Yet now they grasped the haunting truth. I was here, poised not in anger, but in control. They would come to see that my silence, a theater filled with unspoken power, was not a surrender, but a blueprint for their downfall, an undetected tremor before the seismic shift. My impact would echo through their decisions, felt long after I withdrew from the scene. This was not a confrontation. This was domination. I stood at the precipice of their reality, a storm ready to unleash its fury. And as they ambled precariously toward their own undoing, they would come to understand. Real revenge is not loud. It is a whisper, a shadow circling closer until the moment of impact renders them helpless. Soon, they would know every last word spoken was not a privilege, but a necessity earned from their still fresh agreement. And within that realization, I found my triumph. The atmosphere shifted subtly, like the dark before a storm, leaving an unsettling tension in its wake. I watched as they maneuvered in the boardroom, a disarray of frantic gestures and muted words flowing like water around the rocks of their insecurity. The facade of confidence, once so unshakable, began to crack, edges fraying under the weight of unvoiced fears. Each exchange punctuated by hurried glances, smiles that hovered nervously over the abyss of doubt. They were circling the precipice, unaware of how profoundly they had miscalculated my absence. I lingered at the periphery, a ghost in the corner, their uninvited specter. They spoke of strategies, navigating a landscape rendered treacherous by the very void I had left. With every word that faltered on their tongues, I could feel my influence tightening around them like a noose, a subtle reminder of who they once relied upon. "Let's revisit last quarter's performance metrics," someone suggested, their voice faltering in the gathering storm. They all nodded, the movement almost instinctual, driven by an amalgam of nervousness and unacknowledged dread. My presence was both their salvation and their undoing. I had not returned to mend their fractures, but to showcase the depth of their reliance, to illuminate the shadows in which they had thought themselves secure. For every proposition they articulated, I let silence ricochet through the room, let it echo until their words became mere reflections in a hall of mirrors, distorted, faintly mocking. Their eagerness shocked me, an urgency unfurling with every request, all predicated on the illusion that I was a mere resource. They feared the inner workings of my silence far more than they ever acknowledged, saw threats where no utterances existed, as if my quietude was not part of a calculated strategy, but a deceitful game they could twist to their favor. "Would you take a look at this draft?" another colleague ventured, the thin veneer of confidence slowly peeling away. The trembling hand that extended the document reflected the reality no one wished to articulate. It was astonishing how quickly the balance of power transformed, how willingly their desperation ignited. I took the paper, the delicate weight of it flaring my senses, sensing the fear thrumming beneath their breaths. Every word I might offer bore significance, monumental in its implications. I would not speak hastily. I would not offer what they craved: approval. Instead, I would weave their cravings into a tapestry of their own making. "Let's discuss what I can offer, shall we?" I countered, my voice leveled, tempered to cut through, to draw them in closer. The stillness that followed felt alive, buzzing with anticipation, a sniper's breath before the shot. They leaned into my quiet authority, each one more willing than the last to place their cards on the table. I let the tension stretch longer, a patient hand resting low on the reins of their ambitions, tightening just enough to send them reeling for my approval. "You think you've replaced me," I said, framing my words carefully. "But in reality, you've only created a gaping distance between what you believe you can achieve unburdened by my presence and the cold reality that success is built upon collaboration." They shifted, bodies coiling under the weight of newly discovered truths. Their eyes flitted from one to another, a wordless conversation raging beneath the surface, an acknowledgement of their crumbling superiority. It was an exhilarating acknowledgement to witness their masks slip. As I began to excuse myself from the room, I turned back, my silhouette framed against the harsh lights. "You can keep your offers. I will rebuild quietly while you flounder under the weight of your choices." The moment hung, suspended, mingling threat and promise. No one dared to respond, even as they sensed the final pieces of my trap clicking into place. When the door closed behind me, that stillness grew heavy, a calm filled with the knowledge that I didn't need to exercise anger or retribution. The very act of living would become my victory. I understood now that their need for me ran deeper than they ever intended to admit. They remained shackled to their own choices. I inhaled that stillness, tasting victory on my tongue, savoring the slow burn of my influence as it wrapped around them like smoke. They had replaced me without telling me, but I had taken on the mantle of their consequence, an exquisite reckoning poised to unfold without warning. Silence was my reward, my weapon, and I embraced it completely, prepared to watch them slowly drown in the very tides they had miscalculated. I was an architect of their downfall, and now that they had relied on me, they would learn that shadows do not disappear. They merely await the moment to reveal their true power. The replacements began to fade, one by one, as if the energy that once buoyed their ambition had been siphoned away, leaving only remnants of what they thought they could build without me. It was quiet at first, a whisper in the corner of the office, unnoticed among the bustling hubbub of urgent meetings. Yet with every departure, a resignation letter slid silently across a desk, a lingering farewell that carried the weight of disillusionment. I felt a dark satisfaction ripple beneath my cool composure. At lunch the following week, I overheard hushed conversations, punctuated by the familiar timbre of worry interwoven with the threads of forced laughter. They gathered in clusters, eyes darting around as if the walls themselves could betray them. I smiled inwardly as I sipped my coffee, a spectator in this theater of unraveling confidence. Their laughter was brittle. I could hear the cracks beneath the surface. Each exit resonated like glass shattering, a sound so pure, yet imbued with a sense of inevitable doom. Then came the moment that struck like a bell tolling in a silent church. One of the replacements, the bright-eyed optimist who had boldly filled my old seat, approached me. Her smile faltered, the mask slipping just enough for me to catch the flicker of fear in her gaze. "Can I ask you something?" she breathed, barely above a whisper, hesitation anchoring her down. The irony was not lost on me. She, the one who had forsaken the past, now sought counsel from the ghost she believed they had exorcised. I met her eyes, calm and resolute, and nodded ever so slightly. She continued, her voice trembling. "I don't know what to do anymore. It's like everything is falling apart. We thought we could manage without you, but—" A shiver danced along her spine, manifesting in the cursory glances she cast toward the door as she spoke. "Failure," I replied, almost a whisper, letting the weight of the word hang in the air, heavy as lead. "It's a powerful teacher, isn't it?" My tone remained light, a calculated facade cloaked in a veneer of empathy. She nodded, mouth opening and closing like a fish, searching for a lifeline. I witnessed the realization settling in her expression, a dawning awareness that my absence had created a void so vast, their progress heaved beneath its crushing weight. They had thought they were rising, building a bright future untethered by my presence. But all that glittered turned to dust. I savored her desperation, a bittersweet nectar, feeding my sense of control. "I don't want to lose this project," she said, the edges of her voice buckling under pressure. The unspoken acknowledgement of her fledgling authority, her position wrangled from my shadow, felt like a confession. Did she not see how quickly she had transmitted that questioning gaze to me, the specter sitting before her in quiet judgment? "Perhaps it's time to reassess the foundation," I suggested, my words slicing through her hesitation like a knife through silk. "What choices lead to this moment?" With each inquiry, the flood of their ignorance became more profound. I was no longer just a silent observer. I was the arbiter of their failure, scripted in the force of my restraint. Every demand they had made, each sigh of relief in my absence. I let all of that pile onto her shoulders, furnishing her not with advice but rather with glimpses of the stark truths they had chosen to overlook. The past is a reflected surface. It shows us who we are unless we're too naive to see the image staring back. Her eyes searched for mine, a desperate plea hanging in the air, but I had stepped out of the role they had cast me in. No longer the asset they had so carelessly dismissed, I had become their oracle, revealing the foundation beneath their feet to be made of glass, thin, fragile, shimmering with that precarious beauty that promised shattering. As I walked away from her, her breath hitching in her throat, her confusion palpable, I felt a quiet sense of control spiral through me. I would not take her hand and guide her toward salvation. I would watch as they fell one by one, the very individuals they had placed on my crumbling pedestal. What I had built in their absence was far more enduring than their miscalculations. I would remain a ghost, chained not to the past they tried to erase, but to the architect of their collective failure. I knew that their facade would falter eventually, collapsing under the stark confines of their own choosing. And as I watched their despair deepen, I savored the knowledge that position is fleeting, but presence is persistent. I needed only to stay in the shadows, comfortable in my silence, while they unraveled before my gaze. Each departure heralded a deepening silence within their walls, the unbearable weight of their choices materializing in waves. With that stillness enveloping me, I found refuge in the cold truths, the culmination of moments that led them to seek my succor while condemning themselves to oblivion. They could not see me, but they would feel my impact long after the door closed behind them, as they caught glimpses of what they had thought they held, now drifting just beyond their reach. They thought I would scream, that I would lash out like an uncaged beast, but I walked away. No shouts, no pleas, just silence swallowing my retreat. Each step felt like a counterweight dropping, accompanying the hollow echoes of an authority they'd long forsaken. I savored that emptiness, an unmarked road stretching before me, devoid of familiar landmarks, yet rich with the thrill of new freedom. They replaced me without warning, and in that cataclysm of betrayal, I had been refined. I had uncovered treasures hidden beneath the shards of their incompetence. Leverage, insight, alliances, a bounty gathered in quiet patience. Each day afterward was a slow unraveling for them, and a careful stitching for me. I had replaced not just my role, but our entire shared narrative. In their frantic rush to forget me, they had unwittingly etched my presence into the fabric of their every decision, reflecting upon the negotiations that had taken place, the whispered words, the furtive glances exchanged under the fluorescent lights. I recognized their panic encapsulated in those fleeting moments. Their laughter now felt brittle, as if it could shatter with the mere brush of an errant breeze. I was the phantom that haunted their ambitions, the specter lurking in the perimeter, watching the fortress they had erected slowly crumble under the weight of their arrogance. Yet now, as I traced my fingertips over the cold surface of their dwindling empire, I understood the weight of closure. There was no sense of triumph, no celebratory dance around a flickering fire of vengeance. Rather, there was only an absurd tranquility, an indifference that rolled over me like a soothing fog. The emotional cost had been heavy, but it had transformed into clarity, an exquisite epiphany that hovered just out of reach, growing sweeter as I moved further from their grasp. With every resignation that flicked through the office like a sparking fuse, I felt the internal cadence of their downfall. These weren't just people, mind you. They were cogs in a machine that had wronged me. Each departure was a note in a silent symphony I orchestrated from the shadows, a reminder that presence mattered more than position. I stood on the cusp of something fundamentally intimate, the fine line between retribution and resurrection. I had become unbreakable in my quietude, cutting the ties that had once bound me to that table, the one they believed was theirs alone. I earned closure, not through the celebration of their demise, but by walking away, choosing solitude over the hollow glow of their acknowledgement. The doors whispered secrets as I passed. Their hinges creaked familiarity, thrusting me into the world awaiting beyond their confines. I let the quiet absorb me, the silence no longer a signal of defeat, but a declaration of strength. Every step I took away from them was like a pen stroke, an artful signature of my unfolding narrative, scarred yet resolute, as I carved out the shape of my future. In the distance, I could see the horizon stretching wide, roads unfurling like an invitation. No longer anchored to their chaos, I would leave footprints behind only for me to remember. I grasped that freedom isn't loud. It doesn't require confetti or fanfare. It exists in the gentle rustling of leaves in a twilight breeze, in the way a solitary figure fades into the dusk. I wouldn't miss them, nor would I detest them. They had gifted me with an essential lesson, an articulation of power, not the kind that forces submission, but cultivates the kind that lingers, like the shadow shifting just past the edge of one's vision. They thought silence was surrender. It wasn't. Silence was my blueprint. And now they live in it, whether they hear me or not.